Chapter 1, narrated by Ann Potter. Autumn couldn't decide which socks to put on. The stripy ones had confused the bees yesterday, and the ones with flowers meant she'd end up with a mountain of goat saliva round her ankles again. Today she'd go for the Little Miss ones. Her granny had bought them at the Barras last Christmas on a knock-off stall, but said they were from Harrods. Little Miss Celtic was not a character she'd heard of in the books by Roger Hargreaves. Her dad tried to convince her there was a whole series of books. Oh, aye, Little Miss Rangers, Little Miss Hibs. But by the time he got to Little Miss Inverness Caledonian Thistle, the game was a bogey. With one foot still undressed, she tussled about to find the other sock at the back of the untidy drawer. "Your room looks like a storm blew through a jumble sale," her mum would say on a daily basis. But Autumn liked it that way. Chaos brought comfort. "I never feel like anything is lost. It's just playing hide and seek," she'd reply. Still with only one sock, she squinted further and could just see the boiled egg head of Mr. Happy peeking out from behind a welly warmer. One of her brothers must have got mixed up in the wash. "He'll do," she said, and pulled the yellow sock snake from behind the tumble of winter tights, slid it up over her sparkly toes so he nestled just above the ankle like a smiling sun. "Today is gonna be a good day," Autumn said. "I can feel it." She'd always had a sixth sense for things like that. Her Auntie Barbara was the same, although her mother said it was the gin. Cherry Blossom City was somewhere she'd always wanted to go, but because it involved several modes of transport and a trek through the car park at the back of the Aldi's, she'd not been trusted to go before. But now she'd hit that magic birthday. Permission was granted. Game on. "Autumn!" her mum shouted up from the kitchen. "You'll miss the next flock of geese if you don't get your skates on, hen. They're leaving in 5 minutes and you know how hissy they get if you make them late." "Coming!" She laced up her rollerblades with a double knot, picked up her backpack, the one with the secret compartment for snacks, phone, wallet, and a family-size pack of Skittles because, well, you never know, and bounced downstairs 2 at a time.
Chapter 2, narrated by Elisa Cañas. "Hello, hen, I need to see your ticket." Autumn was jolted back to reality by the kindly old ticket conductor, peering down at her over the top of his half-moon spectacles. The soft lilt of his accent had propelled her back to happier times. She often wondered, though, now 10 years had passed since that peculiar day and her first attempt to reach Cherry Blossom City, just how much of what she remembered from her childhood was even accurate. She knew she'd been a happy kid, there was no doubt about that. Her dad, a big bear of a man, was the king of practical jokes, and her mum, perpetually sporting a well-worn apron, passed down from her mother and now one of Autumn's most treasured possessions, was forever buzzing about the kitchen, humming along to the radio. "A good cake is equal parts flour and love," she'd quip whenever anyone asked the secret to her delectable baked goodies. Autumn rummaged in her backpack for her ticket, cursing herself again for not putting things properly in a designated pocket. She handed it over, received a cursory nod in return, and continued to gaze out of the condensation-soaked window into the night, willing herself back to her favourite memory. She didn't often allow herself the space to really vanish into the past, but a deserted train carriage on a dark November night seemed like a safe enough place to let herself retreat. She thought about Max. During her teenage years, whenever she'd heard the other kids exclaiming how much they hated their brother or sister, she'd had to bite down hard to stop herself from yelling at them how lucky they were to have a ready-made best friend to travel through life with. Autumn and Max had been a whirlwind of energy and fun, and also squabbles and chaos, and she knew this was another memory that was so rose-tinted it was practically phosphorescent. But still, what she wouldn't give for just one more adventure with Max, especially today. The train rumbled on. Using her sleeve as a makeshift windscreen wiper, she drew an arc with her forearm and peered harder into the abyss. She could just about make out villages through the rain-streaked glass between stretches of wide, open black nothingness. The motion of the train and the emotion of the day was starting to take their toll. She rested her forehead on the cool glass and allowed her focus to relax, till all she could see were her own familiar features staring back at her. Her dark tangle of curls tumbling down from beneath her beanie, her pale complexion almost doll-like against the night. She crinkled her button nose, the same nose as his, and stared into her eyes, which sparkled with wonder like jewels in a pool. Little Miss Mischief, her dad used to call her. She blinked slowly, the movement of the carriage lulling her into a deep state of rest, but her reflection didn't. Unless she had imagined it, her reflection had winked. She blinked again, more deliberately this time. Her reflection grinned back at her. It was him. It's time.
Chapter 3, narrated by John Craig. Autumn could barely contain herself now. She dreamt of this moment as long as she could remember. Things had been different since she'd set out on this journey. She let go of the breath she'd been holding in anticipation and darted her eyes around the carriage. She looked at the other passengers curiously, trying to see if anyone else had witnessed what she just had. The grown-up couple sat across the aisle from her were still just as absorbed in their magazines as they had been a second ago. According to the covers, hers was about graphic design and his was about how to become a stomach-fat-burning machine. Autumn thought it was wonderful that there were so many things to be when you grow up, and she wondered what life had in store for her. She had the distinct suspicion it would involve adventure. She whipped her head back around to the window. There was no way she couldn't recognize it. Her brother's cheeky face, smiling back at her and jabbing his finger emphatically towards the back of the train. It was obvious what Max wanted. She slipped out of her seat and padded back through the carriages, the ghostly form of her brother bobbing up and down outside, keeping pace. What on earth was going on? Autumn pushed open the door into the last carriage of the train. It was empty. Movement beyond the glass caught her attention, and she looked up at her new companion to see his eyes wide with enthusiasm, waving and pointing at the floor. She looked down and saw only her feet, confusion spreading across her brow. Her questioning shrugs brought her no answer from Max. He gestured more emphatically, and Autumn finally realized he was pointing at the seat. She dropped to her knees and peered into the shadows. There it was, something glinting out of the gloom. She pulled it out and examined it in the light. Autumn's jaw dropped open into a gasp. Cupped in her hand was a shiny, metallic green ticket, embossed with an unmistakable pink cherry blossom.
Chapter 4, narrated by Ruth Getz. She clasped the ticket tightly, feeling overwhelmed with wonder and delight. "Woohoo! Yippee!" she exclaimed. Autumn could barely contain her excitement. Then she remembered she had to keep quiet. She peeked over her shoulder to see Max floating a few inches off the ground, looking slightly ghostly and transparent. He was glaring at her. "Autumn, stop yelling. You are always so noisy." Autumn shrugged. It was annoying to be told off by her younger brother, but then again, he did have a point. She carefully tucked the ticket for Cherry Blossom City into her jeans pocket, dusted down her knees, and made her way back to her seat, Max floating along behind her, invisible to everyone apart from Autumn. Just as she was walking along, there was a tap on her shoulder. "Autumn Jemima Tabitha Ticklesworth, is that you?" Autumn turned around and saw an extremely tall, flame-haired woman wearing a tiger print trouser suit, accessorized with oversized star-shaped spectacles, gazillions of necklaces, and pink dangly diamante earrings. "Auntie Kiki, what are you doing here?" "I could say the same about you, young lady. Where's your mother? Why aren't you at school? And most importantly, do you know where I can get some chocolate on this darn train?"
Autumn's mouth dropped. Auntie Kiki was her mum's older sister. Many years ago, she had been a fashion designer to the stars, but now she spent her time travelling the world far and wide. There was no way Autumn would be able to keep her journey to Cherry Blossom City a secret. She looked up at Max. He looked at her. They both sighed and shrugged. It looked like Auntie Kiki would be coming along for the ride.
Chapter 5, narrated by Claire Story. It was night time, and the train was very quiet. Apart from the low, urgent rumble of the tracks and the rattling of a loose window, the only sound was a gentle, rattling snore from Aunt Kiki, who had been dozing in the seat opposite for almost 2 hours. Her magazine, a tattered vintage copy of Vogue, which she had produced with a shriek of glee from her rucksack, lay open and forgotten in her lap, her head nodding contentedly in time with the motion of her seat. Autumn had found a slightly melty Kit Kat deep in the bottom of her coat pocket, which Kiki had snaffled greedily, and finally, after almost 45 minutes of chatter, Kiki was dozing and dribbly, smiling a chocolatey sleep. Autumn peeped out. She had pulled her heavy green duffel coat over her head and pretended to sleep. She'd explained carefully to Kiki that she was travelling to Cherry Blossom City and how she was going to visit a friend of her mother's when she got there. And all of that was true in the main part. Of course, there were a few things that she'd left out. She certainly hadn't mentioned any of the bears, or the fact that there was something wriggling and giggling in a small wooden box inside her other coat pocket. She placed a hand over its warm corners and whispered, "Not far now." She hadn't seen Max for a while now. He'd always found Aunt Kiki rather challenging, and she knew he'd be angry she was tagging along. But Max was the only one who could help her when they got to Cherry Blossom City. Quietly leaving her seat, she turned the metal handle of the adjoining door and stepped through into the musty, dusty darkness of the next carriage. As she took a moment to let her eyes adjust, a gruff, commanding voice boomed through the silence. "And where do you think you're going, madam? And where is my magic monkey?"
Chapter 6, narrated by Carol Richards. Autumn froze. Standing in front of her was the tallest, widest, ugliest man she had ever seen in her life. She felt her knees begin to tremble. Oh my gosh, she thought to herself, what have I got myself into? The man again shouted at her, "Where's my magical monkey?" Spittle flew into the air as he shouted and screamed and ranted, and drool began to form in the corners of his mouth. His eyes were as black as coal. He meant business. Autumn instinctively put her hand in her coat pocket. In the corner of her eye, something caught her attention. She chanced a glimpse. It was Max. She turned to him. "Max, Max, what are you doing here? Have you come to help me?" "Who are you talking to, girl?" Max slowly walked towards Autumn, and he gestured to the pocket, the one with the box in. Perhaps this monkey really was magical and could get her out of this dreadful situation. Then Max was gone. Oh. The man continued to rant and rave. Autumn's knees were really shaking now. She couldn't get a word out. She was petrified, but then she remembered Max had pointed to a pocket. She put her hand in and drew out the box carefully. The man's eyes widened with glee. "It's there, you've got it!" Instinctively, she held the box in both hands, shaking slightly. Suddenly, something happened. The air began to shimmer slightly. You know, like in the desert when they get a heat haze. What's it called? Oh, a mirage. It was something like that. And then, without warning, everything stopped. The man, who had been about to try and grab the box from Autumn, even the drool at the corners of his mouth had frozen. Everything had stopped. Suddenly, Autumn found herself looking down at the scene. She was there, holding the box,
The man was there, frozen solid. No Max, though. I hope this has something to do with getting to Cherry Blossom City. As she was looking at the picture, that's what she called it now, something started to happen. It started to fade. She didn't know how it was fading or quite what was happening, but it was definitely fading. It was getting just less. Autumn didn't know where she was. She didn't know if she was up or down or on the ceiling or what was happening. The next time she looked down, it was all gone. All of it. There was nothing. Where on earth was she?
Chapter 7. Narrated by Greg Marston. Autumn felt very afraid. It was cold. There was nothing. It wasn't black, but it wasn't light. It was a void. It wasn't cold. It wasn't hot. She was glad that the tall, wide, ugly man seemed to have gone, for now, and guessed that maybe he'd been a result of her eating too many of those delectable baked goodies her mum made her on the train journey. Too much sugar. But what was happening to her? Was she losing her mind? She'd seen Max, then he disappeared. She'd seen what she thought was a reflection of Max in a window. Then there was Auntie Kiki, and all the other peculiar things that had happened over the last 10 years since she first tried to get to Cherry Blossom City. And now this, stuck in a void. Or was it? In the distance, on the horizon, was a sliver of bright, shining light, like a needle that someone had shone a torchlight onto. And there was a sound coming from the direction of the light. It was like a low droning, almost a bit like somebody was humming. And there was no tune to it. It was all over the place, but there was something strangely, almost intoxicating, that drew her towards it. She still had a backpack and the box in her pocket, from which came another noise, like a giggling sound. It did sound like a monkey, but she was being called by this tuneless, droning noise and the shaft of light. She wanted to get to it quickly, so she bent down, took her backpack off, put on her rollerblades, which she'd taken off while she was on the train, and found that even though she was in a void, there was something beneath her feet, so she started to rollerblade toward the sound and the light. As she got closer, the sound got louder and louder.
Chapter 8. Narrated by Margaret Ashley. Autumn continued to approach the sound. The nearer she got, the bigger and brighter the light, and the louder the sound. Eventually, she arrived at a blazing, glistening portal. Autumn stopped and stared, unsure what to do next. The light and the sound was drawing her in. It was so hypnotic, it was like a magnet pulling her in. She had to go through it. She couldn't stop herself. She was being sucked through it. Whoomph! She was there. Where? Where was she? What was happening? She sort of recognized the place, as if it were a dream or a memory. That was it. It was a memory. She had been here before. She was standing in Princess Gardens in Edinburgh, where she had been when she was a young girl. And there he was, the man she remembered meeting, sitting on the park bench, dressed in full Scottish national costume, complete with tam o' shanter. The big, burly man, with the red hair and red beard, with his bagpipes by his side. He was, as she remembered him, eating his picnic lunch and humming away to himself. It was the humming that had drawn her to him in the first place. The strange, tuneless tune that cast a spell over her. But why was she here?
Chapter 9.
Narrated by Julie Love. Ah, there you are, lass. Did you get it? The burly, red-bearded man bellowed. Get it? A dazed Autumn echoed. The newspaper, lass. Autumn looked down, and to her amazement found she was clasping an evening news, dated Thursday, the 11th of December, 1986. This was huge. Edinburgh's where she'd come on her 18th birthday all those years ago. It had been a surprise visit to see her eccentric grandad. She remembered now. She'd gotten lost and asked Redbeard for directions. He was humming because he could never remember the words to songs, and he explained that was why he'd taken up the bagpipes. That day he was playing for tourists waiting for the 1 o'clock gun. Or was he? The gardens under the watchful eye of the Scott Monument were bursting into life. They were festooned with Christmas lights, high hopes and festive cheer, the excited clamour of the carousel crowds growing louder and louder. That's when it hit her. Thursday, the 11th of December, 1986, was the day her grandad disappeared. Boom! The gun exploded, and Autumn was instantly shot back on board the train. Still clutching the newspaper in her tense, sweaty hand, the front-page headline screamed, "Quarantine Monkey Disappears from Capital Research Facility." Autumn patted the box in her pocket reassuringly as the train doors swished open. "Tickets, please!" The chubby guard looked friendly, with good teeth and smiling eyes, so Autumn asked when they might reach Cherry Blossom City. "Cherry Blossom where? Never heard of it, love." "Ticket?"
Chapter 10, narrated by Elizabeth Bloom. There was no time to ask questions now. The look on the chubby guard's face was evolving into deep suspicion.
"Oh, my ticket? It's back at my seat over there,"
panicked Autumn. "I'll come with you then," said the chubby guard, rocking back and forth from his heels to his toes. Autumn's heart started to race. Did she even have a ticket? She certainly didn't buy one before jumping on board, but something was telling her that this was the train she was destined to be on.
"Excuse me, darling,"
squealed a voice.
"Excuse me. Yoo-hoo!"
A small, crumpled lady with a straw hat far too big for her head rattled a paper from one of the seats ahead. She didn't appear from behind the newspaper, which she held incredibly close to her face, far too close to actually read it.
"I'll be with you in just a moment, madam," said the chubby guard.
"Yes, well," said the hidden lady.
"The young lady's companion has nipped to the food carriage. He looked awfully famished, so I should imagine he'll be there a good while."
The chubby guard thought for a moment, and then smiled broadly.
"Come on then, to the food carriage, young lady. If you wouldn't mind just a moment," said the hidden lady. "It's awfully stuffy in this carriage, and the window seems to be stuck. Can you please give me a hand?"
Just then, Autumn's stomach lurched. The hidden lady was holding the exact same newspaper Autumn was clutching, dated Thursday, the 11th of December, 1986. Confused and amazed, Autumn stood gaping at the discovery, until she was snapped out of it by the chubby guard.
"Stay right there, please, young lady. I don't allow fare dodgers on my train." "Not a problem, madam. They can be a little bit stiff, these old windows."
The chubby guard pulled up his trousers, weighed down by a mass of keys attached to his belt buckle, and started yanking at the window unsuccessfully. As he started to struggle and clamber over the top of chairs, Autumn heard the hidden lady.
"Go. Your brother is waiting for you at your seat."
Completely stunned, Autumn watched the chubby guard and edged back. She strained to peer on her tiptoes, trying to steal a glimpse of the hidden lady.
"Go. We will talk when we get to Cherry Blossom City."
Chapter 11. Read by James Warrior. Without knowing why it happened just then, Autumn had a sudden vivid memory of a meeting she had had a year ago when on holiday in Yorkshire. She had met with a Morris dancer called Noel. Noel had seemed to her to be a really nice young man. He was tall and strong-looking and had an open, honest face. Autumn had even begun to feel stirrings of affection towards him. But why was he dressed like a complete and utter idiot? A good-looking young man of about 19 or 20, wearing a silly hat with bells and bows on it, buckled shoes with white stockings and carrying a sheep's bladder on the end of a stick. And he had a weird accent, too. It certainly wasn't from Yorkshire, and it certainly wasn't attractive. A kind of nasal South London whine. Noel, too, had felt an instant attraction towards Autumn, and felt that he needed to justify himself. "Listen," he said, "I'm here on a mission. You see that chubby man over there in the other Morris dancing group?" "Yes, I do indeed," said Autumn. "Well, he's a sorcerer who put a curse on me and made me talk like this. I'm actually a Welshman, and I want to get back to my normal voice and go back home to Ammanford. But the only way I can do it is to dance in anger against him. This isn't just a sheep's bladder," said Noel, raising his stick. "It's filled with lead. And if I dance up to him and hit him over the backside with it at the same time as reciting Wordsworth's The Daffodils, then I'll get my own voice back." "Are you sure?" said Autumn. "It sounds very unlikely to me." "I'm certain," said Noel. "I was told by a fortune-teller in Brighton called Eva Petrulengo." Suddenly, Autumn realised the significance of this memory. The chubby dancer and the chubby ticket collector were one and the same person, and if she wasn't careful she would be his next victim. The thought of sounding like Noel was altogether a nightmare. She started dancing in imitation of the Morris men, and then, bending forward and running at him like a second row forward, she pushed the fat ticket collector across the carriage and out of the window. Instantly, it seemed as though she was lying in the warm sunshine in the Edinburgh Park. Her uncle was gently bending over her and giving her a small parcel wrapped in greaseproof paper. "What's this?" said Autumn. "A fish supper?" "No," said her uncle. "It's Lincolnshire sausages, not cooked yet. Mind you don't eat them raw now." Max looked on, smiling.
Chapter 12. Narrated by Fran Burgoyne. Autumn took out her diary. These visions, or waking dreams, or whatever they were getting more and more bewildering. The bit with Noel was new. She had to write that down. She took out her diary, the cover a mess of doodles, the cherry blossom logo, a portal, her roller skates. The inside wasn't much better. Jumbled pages crammed with scraps of memories and not great sketches of the people and places from the portals. It was hard to find a place to squeeze Noel in. Max giggled as she tried to draw him, getting his proportions all wrong. A pea head on a beefcake body. Autumn sighed. Art was not her thing. Her uncle looked on with a vague, benevolent smile. The smile of an uncle who lets you ruin your appetite by eating 7 cookies before dinner. She knew from experience she wouldn't be able to talk to him. He was stuck, it seemed, like a half-memory. But then, he had gone to Peru to study monkeys when Autumn was very small, so maybe that was why. She just couldn't remember him well enough. She knew she must be getting close to Cherry Blossom City if the sorcerer was back. He was like the boss in a video game. Always there, always stronger, and always cheating. Changing appearance to disguise himself and pushing her into the dream space to stop her arriving at Cherry Blossom Station. She hadn't quite decided if the portals were his work or not. They seemed to keep her away from the train sometimes, but others, they dropped her back in. And what did he want with that monkey? He called it a magic monkey, but the newspaper said it had escaped from quarantine in a research facility. Maybe it glowed in the dark or something. Max reckoned he needed it for a spell, but Autumn didn't like that idea. She kept imagining the sorcerer hunched over a bubbling cauldron, calling to his apprentice for monkey brains. And Autumn was a vegetarian. Just at that moment, the monkey in question dashed across the grass, heading for the cliff that Edinburgh Castle stood on. Autumn looked at Max. They didn't need to say anything, but both jumped up and sprinted after the monkey.
Chapter 13, narrated by Claire Bradshaw. Monkeys can run very fast when they want to, and have a way of taking the longest route possible, especially when they know they're being chased. Down the narrow streets, up the rocky hill towards the castle, round a tree at least 4 times. The monkey was having a lot more fun than Autumn and Max. Breathlessly, Autumn shouted after the giggly, hairy little fella. "Who are you? What do you want?" The monkey suddenly stopped by an old wooden door nestled in the rock, picked the lock with his little monkey fingers, swung the door open, and disappeared inside. Autumn and Max followed. What else to do? They were now inside a long, dark tunnel. There was a strange sort of tuneless hum echoing through the damp air, and at the end of the tunnel, a dazzling white light. Oh no, not again, Autumn thought. Another portal? Where will I end up this time? Somewhere awful, I bet. Like that birthday party Auntie Kiki threw for me. She made me a chocolate cake with cauliflower from a recipe she got from Coco Chanel. It was the worst ever and all my friends laughed at me. Please, let's not go back there. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the tunnel. "Autumn? Autumn Jemima Tabitha Ticklesworth?" The large, misshapen silhouette of the sorcerer moved closer and closer, and as he did, he got smaller and smaller, and by the time he was in front of Autumn and Max, he was the size of a big dog, or a small donkey. It was a good trick, but she wasn't sure whether to bend down to greet him. That might be a bit rude. "You are not welcome at Cherry Blossom City. I forbid you to go there. I would have thought you'd have got it by now." Why not? Autumn was a bit annoyed. "Consequences. Dreams have consequences, you know. Not just for you, but for the whole world, the solar system, the galaxy, the universe, all 27 universes, which is why you must forget Cherry Blossom City and go home." And what if I don't?
Chapter 14, narrated by Greg Draven. Just as the sorcerer was about to enlighten Autumn as to what would happen, the monkey screeched as if in exquisite pain. This made Autumn yelp in surprise. Max remained still and calm, however a small smile cracked from his mouth. The sorcerer spun round to see what was happening. The tuneless hum they had heard upon entering the tunnel had morphed into the drone of bagpipes, getting louder and louder. As this was happening, the monkey radiated a bright green light just for a split second, then absolute silence. Standing before the 3 of them was a figure, clad head to toe in what seemed to be black petals. The figure caught the gaze of the sorcerer. "My name is Narcissa Sakura, and you know whom I champion. I urge you not to—" And at that moment the sorcerer vanished with a loud pop that echoed in the silence. Well, that was easier than I was expecting," finished Sakura. Sakura turned to Autumn and Max, nodded at Max, and addressed the stunned Autumn. Sakura smiled at her. "Hi, I'm Sakura. Please, come with me. Everyone is waiting for you." "Everyone? What? Everyone where?" Autumn replied. "You know where," Sakura said quietly. "But we must hurry. Something's not quite right here." "Wait, what? What do you mean? You were a monkey. What's going on?" "Look, all will be explained soon, I promise, but right now someone is listening in. They've been listening in this whole time, and I don't know what they want. We have to move." Sakura grabbed Autumn's hand, who instinctively grabbed Max's hand, as they were both pulled through the portal with a flash of light and a deafening whoomp. As Autumn's eyes readjusted, she saw before her a stunning landscape. in the centre of which stood a singular, unfathomably gargantuan blossom tree. "Welcome to my city," Sakura said warmly. "Welcome to Cherry Blossom City."
Chapter 15. Narrated by Roseanne Priest. Autumn stood and stared at the vast expanse of Cherry Blossom City before her. Petals of cherry blossom fell from the sky, and everywhere she looked the world was swathed in the delicate rosy hue of pink cherry blossom. Despite the beauty of this strange new place, Autumn could not help but feel uneasy. Everything was eerily silent, cold and still. The silence felt ominous, and Autumn felt her skin beginning to erupt into goosebumps. She realised she was still holding Max's hand, which felt cold and clammy to her touch, and she was almost afraid to look him in the eye. "I'm not sure I like it here," she whispered. "I don't think we're in Scotland anymore." A single tear trickled down Max's cheek as he looked back at his sister. Sakura chuckled an ominous giggle, drawing Autumn's attention away from Max's pained expression. In the distance, heading through the falling cherry blossom, as if floating on a carpet of candy floss, came the unmistakable silhouette of the small, crumpled old lady with her large straw hat. Autumn remembered with some trepidation what the old lady had said earlier. They would talk when they reached Cherry Blossom City.
Chapter 16. Narrated by Keith Mackenzie. Autumn noticed that the small old lady was holding a copy of the newspaper from 1986, the same one she was reading so intently on the train. She also remembered how the newspaper told of a quarantined monkey disappearing from a research facility in Edinburgh, how on the very same day her wonderful grandad had also disappeared. "My dear," she said from under her large straw hat, "you've arrived at last. I knew you would get here eventually. And Max, too. How nice. 2 for the price of 1. Autumn's thoughts fizzled and popped in her head. It was the monkey that led me here to Cherry Blossom City, the monkey transformed into Narcissus Sakura. And what about the sorcerer in his many disguises, trying to get the magic monkey back, and why was he so determined to keep me away from this place?" The old lady straightened her stance ever so slightly, the features of her face gradually emerging from the shadow cast by her oversized hat. Her skin was weathered and worn. Her eyes had an emptiness, and there was no hint of a smile. "My dear," she said, "you must have so many questions."
Chapter 17. Narrated by Sakshi. And as the old lady fades away, Autumn could hear the giggling sound getting stronger. But it wasn't the sound that she heard in her ears. It was as if the giggle had originated inside Autumn's head, and as the visual of the old lady was blurring away, the sound was getting stronger and taking over her every thought. And that was when she saw Sakura again, and the sounds in her head quietened. "Aren't you happy to finally be here, Autumn?" asked Sakura. "I had thought that you had always wanted to be here, and now would have been very happy to finally be able to see this secret land." "Oh, I had no idea it was you, Sakura. And truth be told, I'm a bit shaken that your idea of being joyful is to overtake my ability to think and simply fill it with your laughter. But surely, I'm glad to be able to see a familiar face here. Now that I'm finally here, and I know that Max and you are here too, I think I feel safe." "It's too early to feel safe yet. You have just arrived. But one thing I know for sure, I don't like to be eavesdropped upon. So let's not drag this conversation anymore. Just join in the silence of your surroundings."
Chapter 18, narrated by Richard Hainsworth. Too confused to think clearly, Autumn did as she was told, listened to the silence, and slumped to the ground, curled up and started to drift off into a dreamy half-sleep. Through billowing, spinning white clouds, the faces of Auntie Kiki, the crumpled hidden lady, the sorcerer, the giggly monkey now transforming into Sakura. Round and round they spin. Autumn, get up now! Autumn felt as if she crashed out of the sky, but luckily had landed on something soft. Get up, get off me! Ewan, is that you? I thought you... I'll explain everything later. Right now, we got to go, and I mean now. Ewan hauled Autumn to her feet and started to drag her away. Wait, my roller skates. Autumn pulled back and twisted round to grab her skates. Lifting them into the air, she saw over her shoulder what Ewan was obviously trying to save them from. She froze, as if she'd been plunged into icy water. Her breath knocked out of her, her eyes wide, searching for some reality to make sense of what was happening. For in the distance, but advancing faster than the train she had recently got off, was indescribable. It had no recognisable form, nor colour really. It was big, and getting bigger, and it had an immense energy. And that energy was bad, and that energy was coming for her. Then Ewan's arm wrapped around her waist and lifted her up as if she was a rag doll, and off they sped in the opposite direction.
Chapter 19, read by Kenneth McConnell. Many miles away, sitting on an old stump, sat the wizard. He smiled his smile and realised what a marvellous thing he'd made. The cloud he had made himself. He had eaten a pound of sprouts and a dozen eggs, stood on his head for 2 days, and let off the eggiest of eggy farts. Pouring into the eggy cloud were meanness, nastiness, knuckle-cracking, accordion music, and just for fun, politicians' smiles and lies. He smiled again, remembering how the cloud moved to his every thought, and said, "Yes, I think that'll do." He knew exactly where Autumn was, and sent the cloud to fetch her, the energy cloud of egginess speeding off to catch her. The cloud enveloped them both and picked Autumn up and sped her back towards the waiting wizard, leaving Ewan coughing and spluttering behind her. She felt rather nauseous, rather like she was on a roller coaster going up and down and couldn't get rid of the smell. The eggy energy cloud stopped and dropped Autumn, coughing and spluttering at the feet of the wizard. Then it shrank into the size of a small black jelly bean and jumped into the wizard's open hand. Autumn looked straight into the eyes of the wizard, whose eyebrows kept moving up and down. He was dressed in a huge cloak of every single green that you could possibly think of. She looked into his eyes once again, and realization hit her in the face like a wet fish. She felt as if cold custard was being poured down the back of her neck. "Grandad?" The wizard smiled down at Autumn and said, "Hello, Summer. Now, about my monkey." Autumn looked at him and said, "You know I hate it when you call me Summer."
Chapter 20, narrated by Pat Garrett. The wizard started laughing, and the more he laughed, the more he farted, until the biggest, most disgusting fart ever released by anyone ever in the history of the universe projected him upwards in a huge, smelly cloud and carried him far away. Autumn could still hear him laughing and farting as he disappeared, and she had to hold her rucksack in front of her face so as not to pass out from the smell. She was just starting to breathe normally again when she heard hurried little footsteps and the voice of an old woman calling out to her. It was the crumpled woman from the train.
"Sydney! Sydney! Come back here immediately! Oh dear, he thinks it's so funny to eat as much farty food as possible so that he can travel free to wherever he wants. He got the sprouts in Belgium. Anyway, I'm Mabel, and you need to get to Cherry Blossom City. The real one. The one where you'll feel really happy and never ever sad." Autumn was astonished and started to ask Mabel about the other one, but Mabel just said, "Shh! Look in your rucksack." Autumn opened it up, and it was full of cherry blossoms. "But how?" "Shh! It's a very dangerous journey to get to the real Cherry Blossom City, and you need to be very, very brave. Eat a few petals, hold a handful in each hand, close your eyes, and take off from the top of that huge mountain on your roller skates. Autumn looked at the place Mabel was pointing to. She'd never seen anything that high.
Chapter 21, narrated by Angela Ness. Autumn gazed to the top of the mountain. Wow! Right, I'll get off then. It's nice to see you, Mabel. You best be getting home for your tea if you're going to keep Grandad's rocket power up. Rude, said Grandad, muttering as he walked away. Oh, Grandad, I didn't mean... But with a huff and a final trump, they were off. Autumn looked down at her feet and her torn holey trainers. The journey was really taking its toll. Wishing she could just land at the top of the mountain, she sat down and cried. My clothes are a mess, my feet have blisters, the smell of that old fart is hanging around me. I'm tired, I'm lonely. She put her head in her hands and bubbled some more. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, well, actually it was from nowhere, Auntie Kiki appeared in all her uniquely fashionable glory, hands on hips. Look at the state of you scruffy wee midden. Stand up. Auntie Kiki. Right, let's get you sorted out. You're nearly there, and when you get there, I'm not having you show me up. Oh, help my Bob, you smell like a rotten fish that ate a dead rat and got stuck in a blocked drain. That was Grandad. Kiki pulled a hose pipe from the bottom of the endless pocket in her Ticklesworth tartan puffer skirt, giving a flash of her patchwork bloomers. She turned it on and pointed it directly at Autumn and began to soak her from head to foot. Autumn screamed in shock as the freezing cold water soaked her through to the skin. Right, said Auntie Kiki, turning off the hose, leaving the shocked Autumn unable to respond. She pulled a towel out from another pocket and passed it to Autumn. Get changed under that. Hurry up. Like you're on a beach. Get on with it. Autumn wrapped the towel around herself. It's warm, she said in surprise, wriggling out of her sodden clothes. Well, of course it's warm. I've had it in my bloomers for a week. Right, you'll be needing some new clothes. Let's see. She dug deep into her pockets again and pulled out everything Autumn needed. When Autumn was dressed, Kiki smiled, most satisfied. Now, don't you look a picture? Autumn looked down at herself. A bright yellow jumper with pink sequins, fluorescent stripes and purple polka dots, a pair of Ticklesworth tartan breeks with a matching hat, great thick woolen socks poking out from under a new pair of tree-shaped walking boots with a beautiful cherry blossom pattern. Autumn smiled widely. Auntie Kiki, you are a fashion guru. I look amazingly, fashionably, ridiculously wonderful. Kiki looked to the top of the mountain. Away on up you go to Cherry Blossom City. Aren't you coming with me? Asked Autumn, disappointed. Kiki pointed to her bright cherry-pink Doc Martens. What? Me? In these shoes? I don't think so, Hen.
Chapter 22. Kenny Blythe. Miles and miles away, the after effects of the world's smelliest, eggiest fart were still being felt. Or should that be smelt? Unfortunately for Ewan, he was the only one in this particular portal feeling and smelling them. The cloud had long since vanished, but Ewan was none the wiser, his eyes still streaming and nose burning. Slowly, he rose to his feet and coughed, spluttered and hacked. Why do things like this happen every time? Every time being this time and that one time 10 years ago during Autumn's first peculiar journey through these portals to try and reach Cherry Blossom City. Before Ewan could continue, a loud, booming but calming voice bellowed, "Don't worry, Ewan. We nearly got her this time." Surprised to hear the voice, but not shocked, a defeated Ewan smiled and nodded his head sadly in agreement. "Now, Ewan, time for you to go, and perhaps have a nice long bath to freshen up." There, followed by what sounded like a chubby forefinger snapping in a magical way against an even chubbier thumb. Snap. Ewan disappeared with a pop. And this portal faded to black.
Chapter 23, written by Joan Wilson and narrated by Gayanne Potter. The meeting and subsequent hosing down from Auntie Kiki had revitalised her, and she felt energised. Spring, spring, yes, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Renewed vigour, a spring in her step. Sakura, the cherry blossom, well, that's all about spring as well. Autumn looked down the mountain, amazed at how far she'd managed to climb already. Raising her head and shielding her eyes against the sun, she could see the summit, but not the city that she was aiming for. But it was time for a break, and pulling off her backpack, she delved inside to see what was left. Unfortunately, there were no Skittles, but instead, her fingers closed around a wooden box. She hesitated, not wanting to meet that monkey again. Drawing it slowly out, she saw that it was a bento box, and she carefully lifted the edge of the lid. Nothing jumped out at her, and she trusted herself to explore the inside. To her delight, there was the perfect mix of sushi and sashimi, green and white rolls of tasty perfection. A small tube of wasabi sauce and a pair of chopsticks enabled her to enjoy the snack. After finishing her meal, she tarried a little while longer, but realised that she was getting chilly. She again rooted through the backpack and pulled out a quilted jacket and an extra woolly hat. The closer she climbed to the summit, the colder it got, and soon she was treading on crisp snow. She looked back and gasped. Below her, the buildings, that had seemed quite big when she was close to them, now appeared small, and the train, which speeded like a white bullet through the landscape, could have been a model like the one she had once seen at an exhibition. Stopping to catch her breath, she looked upwards again and saw what appeared to be a bright light. She realised that it was the sunshine reflecting from windows, and she knew that she was very close to her destination. Rounding a corner, she came across a bus stop. No longer amazed at what could happen, she decided to wait. Before very long, she heard the rumbling sound of an ancient charabanc, and coming towards her was a bright yellow bus with the destination Cherry Blossom City emblazoned on the front in luminous pink letters. The bus stopped and the doors wheezed open, releasing an odour that was strikingly not roses, unless those flowers had been abandoned on an old compost heap in the middle of the hottest summer on record. A familiar figure, wearing a sulphurous yellow uniform, sat behind the wheel. All aboard for Cherry Blossom City! Autumn was so surprised that she fell into the first seat behind the driver. With a whisk and a toot and an engine that sounded like a 70-a-day smoker's cough, they set off at full pelt, screaming round hairpin bends, faster than the speed of dark light. She could see that they were heading for the mountain wall, and with a scream she flung herself across the seat and squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the crash to come. Nothing happened. Nothing. No splintering of glass or screech of metal. Carefully, she opened one eye and then the other. She was surprised to see that she was lying down. Her surroundings looked familiar. She was in her own bedroom. She looked at the pink petal-patterned wallpaper, the plush monkey perched on a shelf, and the familiar posters on the wall. Mel Gibson, Hokusai, and a scene from Disney Fantasia. The light was bright, her head sore and seemed to be constantly banging. She realised that it was the door and a voice asking if she can come in. She shouted, "Yes!" and the door opened and her mum's head appeared cautiously, as if scared of making too much noise. "Well, hen," she said, "that must have been some party you were at last night. I wouldn't have minded too much, but you came home at 3 o'clock in the morning demanding that I find your Mr. Men's socks. And, she went on, I don't know what you'd been eating, but you smelt like the bottom of a zookeeper sandal that had been dropped from a great height into the lavvy. Anyway, I've made you some tea. See if you can get yourself up. Auntie Kiki is coming to visit, and you know how smart she likes to be. Oh, and by the way, she's bringing Grandad, and I hope he leaves those bagpipes at home. Auntie Barbara might pop in, but I'm out of gin. Autumn lay back on the pillow, a groan not quite escaping from her lips. She looked across to the monkey that had now moved and was sitting on her bedside table. In its paws, it was holding a metallic green ticket bearing the legend, Cherry Blossom City Nightclub, Admit 1. He winked at her. And from somewhere above, a heart-shaped pink petal slowly seesawed through the air and landed gently on her head. And Max, there, keeking from behind the curtain, always present and always silent. He looked on, grinning happily. He knew their next adventure wouldn't be far away.